want to take a minute and talk briefly about a couple other details about phagocytosis. Now, there are three really important phagocytic cells. The first two are phagocytic leukocytes, white blood cells, is the neutrophils and the macrophages. If you remember, macrophages don't start off as macrophages, right? They need to be activated further to become macrophages. Neutrophils are always neutrophils from the time they finish their development. They're always phagocytic, and the neutrophils, and they'll always eat only pathogens. You'll be thinking, well, what's the point of eating only pathogens? Isn't that every phagocyte? No, macrophages are important in eating pathogens and other debris. And what we mean by that is they'll also clean up the site of an injury or infection where there is damaged tissue cells. So when your tissue cells have been injured through an infection or a twisted ankle or some other trauma, macrophages are essential for cleaning up the dead material in order to allow repair to take place. So macrophages have a slightly broader role than the neutrophils. Neutrophils are always circulating, always looking for a fight, always phagocytic, and ready to jump in. Macrophages have to be further activated so they can be circulating or fixed, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And something has to activate them. Things like LPS, lipid A, cytokines from lymphocytes. These are the kinds of things that will activate the final development of a macrophage. And then that can begin eating pathogens and other debris. The third category of phagocytic cells are not white blood cells. In fact, they have nothing to do with the blood at all. These are dendritic cells, phagocytic. More importantly, they are involved in initiating the adaptive immune response. So in a couple videos from now, we're going to be talking about our adaptive immunity, which is really the third line of defense that only gets activated if the first two lines of defense have been breached. These dendritic cells are essential in sampling things that appear to be foreign, that have found their way into mucous membranes or skin primarily, and then delivering bits and fragments to our lymphoid organs, places like our lymph nodes, and essentially asking the B and T lymphocytes, does anybody recognize this? This didn't look right to me. Do you recognize it? Should we mount a more intensive response against it? We'll look at the details of that in a future video. But these are your three most important groups of phagocytic cells. Now, I mentioned that macrophages can be wandering, which is primarily in the bloodstream, or they can be fixed in place. Okay, so in the bottom left, let's look at some of the places you can find macrophages. Bottom left, you've got monocytes, that's the precursor to a macrophage before it gets activated, circulating in the blood. And if it detects something that's activating in a chemoattractant, it will actually attach itself to the wall of the blood vessel, crawl to a gap in the cells in the wall of the blood vessel, and squeeze through. We call this diapedesis. And then they can, out of the blood system, they can then crawl their way to the site of the infection and get involved in the battle. These are the circulating or wandering macrophages. Just keep in mind that they wander as monocytes, not activated macrophages. We have macrophages then stationed, what we call fixed macrophages, at vulnerable places. We have macrophages in our joints. Let's work our way from 6 o'clock back all the way around on the clock here. So we've got macrophages in our joints. We have macrophages in the lymph nodes because the lymph nodes get exposed to so many pathogens, as we'll see in a future video, that they are susceptible to infection. We have fixed macrophages in the liver that get a special name. They're called Kupffer cells. We have fixed macrophages in the brain that get a special name called microglial cells. We have alveolar macrophages in the lungs that surround the alveoli of the lungs and make sure that nothing gets across that barrier. By the way, those are the target of some pathogens like Mycobacterium tuberculosis actually goes after those alveolar macrophages. We have macrophages in the cavities of the spleen, which is another lymphoid organ. Macrophages in the kidneys. And then we've got our dendritic cells that are fixed. We don't have wandering dendritic cells, but we have our dendritic cells that are fixed in place in the epidermis and in the mucous epithelial tissues, constantly sampling things that are penetrating and making sure that that all is well. So those are just a couple little gaps that I wanted to fill in our discussion of macrophages. phagocytic cells in general, and I hope that that was helpful to you.